Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, if I can just get your attention. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this very special evening called Powering Up Pituitary Research. And this special event is going to shine a light on the work being done here at the Garvan Institute and at St Vincent's. It's being led by Associate Professor Anne McCormack and her team, and they work hard to help better understand, diagnose and treat pituitary disease. So my name's Sophie Scott, for those of you I haven't met, and I'm delighted to be your host here. And this is a great space for this event, so thank you to the Garvan for inviting us here. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land that we're meeting, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and also to any Indigenous guests joining us here this evening. I also wanted to acknowledge any patients who are joining us in the audience and their carers. Tonight we're going to hear from Associate Professor Anne McCormack. Anne's a staff specialist at the Department of Endocrinology at St Vincent's and a group leader for hormones and cancer research at the Garvan. And she's a conjoint associate professor at UNSW and the president of the Endocrine Society of Australia. And she has time to be here as well. So Anne's going to be talking about her team's amazing groundbreaking research related to pituitary disease. So give Anne a round of applause. You'll meet her later. We're also going to hear from Dr. Ben Jonker. He's a highly regarded neurosurgeon from St Vincent's in Sydney. We're honoured to, I'll give Ben a round of applause. You'll meet him in the panel discussion. We're honoured to have Malini Raj. She's an executive member of the Australian Pituitary Foundation and a patient. She's going to be joining us alongside patient and advocate Jamila Rizvi. So it's been left to me to give you a bit of a 101 about pituitary disease. So I learnt a lot through this work and this research. I just wanted to start by talking about what actually is the pituitary gland and pituitary disease. So it's located deep within the brain, for those who don't know, and it's been called the master gland, or even more poetically, the leader of the endocrine orchestra. That sounds a lot nicer, doesn't it? And it's responsible for the function of hormone glands. If you think about, you've got your thyroid, adrenal glands, and all the reproductive organs. So you can see why it's so important. And you might think that pituitary disease is rare, but you'd be wrong. It's actually very, very common. Who wants to hazard a guess on how many people out of five, how many people do you think develop a pituitary tumour in their lifetime? It's 1 in 5 people. So that's actually really, it's not a rare disease at all. And symptoms can vary, and there's symptomatic tumours affect 1 in 1,000 individuals. And we'll go on to talk about some of the more common pituitary illnesses that are around. But for patients, for example, with acromegaly, it's a condition of excess growth hormone and often happens in children. But there's also other conditions that those children have as well, or patients with pituitary issues. They can have diabetes, high blood pressure, sleep apnea, thyroid goiters, and colon polyps. And each of these issues add to the burden of disease for these patients. And unless you have a really switched-on doctor who is looking for something like a pituitary illness, then the doctor might just think they're dealing with high blood pressure or sleep apnea, and they don't see the full picture of what they're dealing with. And the patient might be seeing a multitude of different doctors as well. And in a similar way, Cushing's disease can be unrecognised because patients they can gain weight, for example, they can develop diabetes and high blood pressure. But if you think about that, it sounds a little bit like someone with sort of the more serious end of obesity as well, or metabolic syndrome. And so some doctors will just see that and they don't look for something like Cushing's disease. And I wanted to just pause briefly for a minute to acknowledge, mentioning Cushing's disease, to acknowledge a friend of mine who I actually lost recently who had Cushing's disease. And I grew up next to Sarah we were kids together, growing up as neighbourhood, one next door to each other. And Sarah was diagnosed with Cushing's disease and also serious bipolar disorder as well when she was in her early 20s. And so she went from someone who was highly intelligent, talented, doing arts law at Sydney University, to someone who really was very challenged with both physical and mental health throughout her whole life. and she only lived to be, well, she's the same age as me, so she was 54. And so I want to acknowledge Sarah, and that nights like tonight will be of comfort to her family to know that research and more work is being done in this area. We know that things like pituitary tumours can result in things like infertility, debilitating fatigue, chronic headaches and vision loss. And 1 in 10 patients with pituitary tumours will need multiple treatments to control the tumour or the production of hormones. And patients need not maybe just one surgery, but multiple surgeries as well. And a delay in diagnosis and treatment burden contributes to a reduced life expectancy and a much poorer quality of life. And that can be equivalent or worse to some really common diseases like rheumatoid arthritis. And as I mentioned, the tumours often show up in younger people, like it did in my friend Sarah. So the quality of life persists for a long period. And interestingly, there's been increasing interest in the community with the long-term health impacts of things like traumatic brain injury, in particular a thing called chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE. And this is very common, in patients that have had a lot of concussions through sport. And Anne McCormack was saying that research shows that 1/3 of people who've got a traumatic brain injury will actually have a loss of pituitary function as well, and that reduces their quality of life and their lifespan. Yet in Australia, there's no resources to look for those patients, to test them, to see what's going on with their pituitary. So as a result, people are going undiagnosed and untreated. It's really clear that there's a significant lack of public awareness and advocacy for pituitary disorders. And we're going to hear more from Jamila on this, I'm sure. But this really has flow-on effects for research and research dollars. And as Dr. Anne McCormack says, when she looked at the data, the main body that funds research in Australia is the National Health and Medical Research Council. And it hasn't given any funding for pituitary tumours since 1997, or any funding for pituitary disease since 2010. Yet we quoted statistics saying this is not a rare condition. And that's despite pituitary disease having an equal or worse quality of life outcomes for people. So, thank goodness for St Vincent's, that's all we can say. I love St Vincent's, I'm a huge fan. For almost 90 years, this hospital has led the way in looking after patients with pituitary tumours and pituitary conditions, looking after the patients, doing complex research. It was as far back as 1933 that the first pituitary surgery, it was Sir Douglas Miller. He was a neurosurgeon, and he did surgery on a Russian man who presented blind. Then another pioneering surgeon in 1964 from St Vincent's, Dr. Kevin Bleasel, he pioneered using freezing techniques to treat pituitary tumours. And surgery has evolved and is evolving to this day, as we're going to hear. In fact, the man who was the first director of the Garvan Institute, Professor Les Lazarus, he set up the first endocrinology lab here to measure pituitary hormones. And the Garvan and St Vincent's has really taken our understanding and pioneered research into understanding growth hormone. And Associate Professor Anne McCormack's research is now looking at the genetics of pituitary tumours and other factors as well, which result in the poorer outcomes that patients have. But another good factor is the fact that patients here have such a good relationship with the Kinghorn Cancer Centre and the Garvan that it means pituitary patients get access to some cancer treatments that they wouldn't otherwise get. St Vincent's looks after the biggest group of pituitary patients in Australia, which is fantastic. And tonight we're really here to put the spotlight on pituitary disease and start the push to raise much needed funds to support research and enable more research. So I'd now like to introduce our special guest keynote speaker, Jamila Rizvi. She's the Managing Director of Future Women, which is a fantastic organisation which is focused on working with governments and other groups to achieve gender equity and equality. She's a sought-after keynote speaker, a best-selling author, and on lots of great podcasts, and she also writes for the Sunday Life magazine. Tonight she's going to be sharing her experience of living with pituitary disease. So give Jamila a big round of applause.
Thank you so much, Sophie, and thank you to all of you for having me here tonight. It's such a pleasure to be in Sydney, and I want to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders, both past and present. Now, I received the lovely invitation from Anne to speak tonight, and I literally do this for a living, but I don't speak about this particular subject, which is myself. That felt remarkably uncomfortable and not something I felt totally able to do. So on my delightful Qantas flight from Melbourne to Sydney of 4.5 hours today, I thought I might write about it and speak about it tonight, not so much from my own perspective, but from the perspective of someone else in my life, because one of the things we need to recognise about pituitary disease and pituitary tumours is that it doesn't just affect the person who lives with it, it affects all of the people who live around them. So I thought I'd share some insights tonight in terms of what it's like to live with someone with a non-functioning pituitary gland like mine, from the perspective of my son Ruffy and what he's gone through. He is 7 years old, and for the nerdy medical types in the room, I have a craniopharyngioma, and I had to learn how to spell that, which was just an added challenge. At a time I didn't need more challenges. So in February 2018, within seconds of entering his office, my brain surgeon told me that my tumour had grown back again. So usually I find that specialists and doctors spend at least a few minutes talking about the weather or their kids' football team or how the family are. I find that unbearable. One of the things I have found is that if you are coming in for the result of your scan and you are dreading bad news, anything said before that is completely meaningless. And you're like, just get to the point. I want the headline. One of the things I loved about my previous brain surgeon was that he often got to the point before he'd even shut the door. By then I had had 2 brain surgeries, and my husband Jeremy and I didn't really even flinch when Prof told us that the tumour had grown back again. We'd done that song and dance before, we were ready to do it again. And so we patiently asked what was going to happen next, and that time we were recommended that radiation treatment would be the best option. And I remember thinking, oh, thank goodness. And you're in a bad place when you are 32 and going, oh, great, I'm going to do some radiation, that sounds easier. But shortly after that relief started to give, you're allowed to laugh, people look very awkward, you're allowed to laugh. Shortly after that relief started to give way to rage, if I'm honest. The unfairness of being young, or I used to be young, and sick, I think never leaves you. Regardless of how well I feel on any given day, there's this threat of regrowth that's always there. The date of the next scan always looms large in the calendar. But those are things I was educated about, and I think very well educated about before surgery. I knew that brain tumours could grow back again. I knew that MRIs had to happen to make sure that you could get checked. I might have flunked Year 10 science, but I've watched 17 seasons of Grey's Anatomy, and I knew that. What I did not know was what the pituitary gland was. What I did not grasp was the many and varied interventions to stop my brain tumour from growing were going to damage that gland irrevocably and totally change my life. So for me, the impact is not that my tumour grows on the pituitary, but rather that removing the tumour has cut off the blood supply to the pituitary. So it's sort of no good to me anymore. And for an awfully long time, longer than the books tell you that it will take to recover, I remember feeling very unsteady and very unstable as a result. And I wondered for a long time if I was ever going to feel anything that felt like normal again. Bone pain is still a daily reckoning for me. It's something I didn't know existed before I started taking growth hormone injections. You can tell by how buff I am. On hot days, my body holds this deluge of water, and that water gets heavy. It makes your skin really tight to the point that your shoes don't fit. It gives me headaches and it stresses my husband out. I still get a shock when I walk past shop windows and I see a reflection of myself that is so different to the reflection I see in my head. That is, my body is a completely different shape and size to what it used to be. Hyperphagia will do that to you. That's not the pituitary's fault, but credit where credit is due. I never thought I would miss getting my period. Turns out you do, in a strange way. Adrenal crises is something that I have now experienced enough times to know that I would like to never experience one again, please. There's a special kind of fear reserved for the realization when you're at home and you're trying to deal with something yourself and you realize that you've gone further than your oral steroids can take you and you can't bring yourself back from the brink and you need to get to hospital. It's about as special as when the TGA updates its website to reflect the availability of your medications to critical. And yet I didn't think about any of that. I didn't know about any of that. I didn't have a sense of any of that. And that's no one's fault. It's not like nobody told me, but it was said so simply. It was said in the form of, oh, you might have to sniff a hormone and take a tablet afterwards. It's like, oh yeah, sure, I can take a tablet, that's fine, I can manage that. And because there was so little education in the community and in the zeitgeist, so little discussion of this particular condition, which, as discussed just a moment ago, it impacts so many people, I still had no real idea of what was coming for me. And while I've mostly made peace with what has happened to me over the last 5 years, my body tends to like to remind me what has happened. I remember watching a cartoon and my son had on the television a few months ago, and the doctor said, it was a dog. The dog doctor said, show me where it hurts. And I just remember thinking, it hurts everywhere. Like everything hurts now. I still catch up with friends who haven't seen me for a while, and the first question will be, and how are you doing now? Are you better? And I just don't really know how to answer that. I don't really know how to respond. So going back to my surgeon's office that day, when you get bad medical news, as I'm sure some of you, at least in the room, know, it throws out the rest of your day. And theoretically, you are capable of going back to work or picking up your kids or whatever it might be, going to the gym, out to lunch with your friends, but you don't do that. And on that particular day, I remember my husband and I were standing on this traffic island outside of Royal Melbourne, and we were sort of holding hands, and the ticking noise sounded, and we were walking across the road. We'd already cancelled the rest of the day's plans. It was 10:30 in the morning, and at the time we were parents to a 3-year-old, and this meant we were alone with like 7 or 8 hours stretching out ahead of us. And for two parents of a 3-year-old, that is very rare and very special time. And I remember we were just looking at each other, thinking about all the things we could have done with that time. We're like 7 to 8 hours, like we could be doing anything right now, anything that is not watching Ruffy go down a slide for the 750th time and being told that you're in trouble because you didn't watch, because it might have been different to the time before. So we're alone, we've just experienced this sort of car crash news, and we had this space, this gift of space, I think, to think and to decompress and to feel all the feelings and to figure out how we were going to properly tell our son. It was this luxury. We could have used the day to plan, the 60 or so radiation sessions I was going to need. We could have talked about what the shock that we were having. We could have talked about shared disappointment, our fear, our frustration. We could have talked about how much we loved each other, but we didn't. We went home and we watched 8 episodes of Vikings, would recommend, and I then made 25 jars of jam, because everyone processes things differently. And I remember the next morning, our rat bag of a kid jumped into bed with us. It was a Saturday morning, and he sort of snuggled in, and he's never been a kid who's had a totally normal childhood, I think, because he's had so much of the please play quietly while the grown-ups talk, and can you go into the other room for a moment, please? That really defined his sort of age 2 to age 5. And yet despite that, and despite having an absent and unwell mother at that time for most of the life, if not all of the life he remembered, he was and is the most divine little human. He is kind and generous and enthusiastic and happy, and just thinks every grown-up's going to take care of him because that's what every nurse at every hospital has ever done, and he thinks everyone's got jelly. Most of that is thanks to Jeremy, who's been wonderful while I've been going through all of the ups and downs and roundabouts. And that morning was the first time I think we had that conversation as a family about what was about to happen to me, because before that he'd been 2 and it was just sort of too young to start to give him any sense of what was going to happen. And I remember cuddling him and telling him that Mum was sick again. I didn't actually use that word because we saw a couple of child psychologists in the early days who said to us that we should use the real names for things. That if you tell a kid that Mum's sick and he then sees Mum with 57 staples in her head, And then the next time he has tonsillitis and you say you're a bit sick, he goes, oh my God, and panics about what's going to happen next. So they told us to use the words. But he was 3. You can't use words like hypopituitarism, and you can't, even the word cancer is meaningless, or brain tumour, whatever it might be, feels too dark and not right for a child. Ruffy had always used the word broken, and so we have continued to do that. And we still talk about my broken brain, which I think stresses other people out, but it works for us. And I remember when we told him, his face went from this sort of blissfully unaware to very concerned. And I explained that the doctors were going to give Mum really special medicine every day for the next few weeks, and that I'd be in hospital, but I would be tired, but hopefully it wouldn't be too bad. And I promised him everything would be okay, and did he have any questions? And he had 2 questions. His first question was, would I have to be at hospital overnight? And that hit me really hard, because it reminds you that when a kid is 3, the depth of what someone is going through is irrelevant to them. What matters is that their parents are at home at night to look after them, and that everyone's at home and everyone is safe. And I explained that, I started to explain that I would be fine, that radiation, I would go into the hospital and then I would come home. And he started getting really angry and saying, Daddy does not do the voices in the books. He does not do the voices, and we can have no books till the medicine is done. And I was like, no, I will be home and I will read the books, and I agree, he's useless. He's a lawyer, he's not born for narration. The second question he had was about Band-Aids. He wanted to know if I was going to have another really big Band-Aid on my head. And again, I think we all know that little kid who associates like the bigger the Band-Aid, the bigger the owie, right, that's underneath it. And mine had been a really fuck off big Band-Aid. Like, it had been really overwhelming, and he didn't want another one of them. And when I told him there'd be no Band-Aid, I remember he jumped up and went, well, that's okay, and just walked out of the room. It would have been 2 years later that this little pouch of glitter arrived in our mailbox addressed to Ruffy, and the instructions accompanying this glitter, I hate glitter, seriously, it doesn't come out of the carpet. But anyway, the instructions accompanying the glitter said that these sparkly pieces of plastic should be put under his pillow the night before his first day of school, and that they would bring good luck, and that they would keep him safe, and that they would make him feel calm. And I remember he was just like, oh, cool, just tossed the packet on the coffee table and asked me how many minutes before we would leave the house for basketball. And I remember picking up that glitter and just sobbing. And I am not a sook, and I am not that person. I'm not a big crier. I'm not particularly sentimental. But Ruffy is our only kid. As you heard earlier, pituitary damage can make fertility a really hard road. And for us, that means there will be no more children. So there won't be more kids for us to watch reach and pass every age and every stage. And so Ruffy's milestones mark our passage of time in a really big way for his dad and I, because they're going to be the only ones we watch. So when there's training wheels off the bike, 400-piece puzzle, bedtime moves to 8 p.m, first pandemic, they're all meaningful. They're meaningful times. But unlike his peers, Ruffy has these other milestones as well. He knows Dad's phone number off by heart. He's known Dad's phone number off by heart since the age of 3. Just in case my cortisol levels get so low that I can't make it to pick him up from childcare or a friend's house. He knows where all my medicines are kept. He knows which colours go in which boxes and in which amounts. He likes using a pill cutter, which is an odd thing. He knows if I'm in bed and I'm describing a bottle or the shape of a tablet, he knows which ones to get, and now that he's 7, can actually read the label. He knows that I like it when he talks to me, when I'm having my evening injections, but he also knows that I don't like it if he's too close, because I'm terrified he's going to bump me. He understands that there are some days that I am just too tired to play, and that he has to drag a box of Transformers onto the bed so that I can be thoroughly entertained. He knows how to call an ambulance, and he has called an ambulance before he could spell ambulance. School, I think, was one of those milestones of all milestones, right? It's the one you focus on when you've got really little kids. And it was such a big milestone for me because I just assumed I wasn't going to be there for it. Ruffy was 2 when I was diagnosed, and I had a really rough time those first few years, and I very quickly became of the view I wasn't going to see this kid start school. But medical research and medical knowledge has meant that I could receive surgeries to preserve my life on multiple occasions. That carefully targeted radiation could pinpoint the exact location to the millimetre at which those beams were going to be fired into my brain to kill off the rest of the tumour. And I have had the care of the most extraordinary team of endocrinologists who have been thoughtful and kind and generous and taken into account me and my body and my preferences and the way my life needs to be lived, as well as the best medicine, and they've been able to find some incredible midpoint. I do not understand why it is that as a community we don't have more knowledge about this incredible part of our bodies, this part of our bodies that impacts literally everything we do every minute of every day and keeps us alive. Don't know why the heart gets all the love. So my husband Jeremy and I have this unspoken rule that we keep Ruffy away from hospitals wherever possible. So my two favourite boys have spent an awful lot of time on the play equipment and at the cafe surrounding Royal Melbourne. But there was one afternoon, however, when Ruffy was not quite 4, and I had an appointment with my neurosurgeon, and we had used up all our child-minding favours, and neither of us have parents or siblings who live in Melbourne, so we had to take him with us. And I remember Ruffy was so excited. He was 4 at the time, and as soon as he knew he was coming to the doctor, he ran into his bedroom to get changed. We were like, "Oh, you can wear what you're wearing," and he came out in a full doctor's dress-up costume, complete with his medical kit and his stethoscope around his neck. He was like, I'm ready to go to the doctor. It was adorable. And he sat so quietly in the waiting room. I think he was a bit overwhelmed by then. And he came into the surgeon's office and he listened really quietly. And it was a good day in the surgeon's office where we were just talking about things kids don't understand, but not scary things. And we stood up to leave at the end of the appointment, and we're all sort of smiling at one another. And then at the last possible moment, Ruffy pipes up and says, "Oh, thanks for fixing my mum's broken brain." And it was the most heart-melting moment. And if anyone has a heart of steel, it's me, but even more so was my brain surgeon. And I have never seen him melt like that in my life. But I remember he sat down and he got on his knees, so he was on Ruffy's level. And he shook his hand and said, "It was an absolute honour, my friend." And I sobbed again outside the hospital that day with my husband, and it was for a different reason to normal, which was a very nice thing. And I remember having to sit down and tell Ruffy they're good tears. These are good tears. Nothing's wrong. Everyone's fine. Mummy's fine. These are good tears. I hope very much that this evening is the start of something very special, the start of the donation of money that is going to help research, that is going to help an enormous number of people who are like me and who are going to be like me in the years to come, whose lives can look very dark at times and very bleak at times, but also can look very hopeful with the help of incredible medical science and medical support. And I hope it is the start of another reason to cry some very good tears. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamila. Thank you for doing that. And it's so interesting to hear about things from a child's perspective, and just the simple things that they want, like their parents to be there, to know that everyone's safe. And that was a beautiful talk. Thank you. Really, really, really heartfelt. I really appreciate it. So we're going to have a panel discussion, and there will be the chance for you in the audience to ask some questions as well. So I'll ask the questions for the majority of it, but if you do have any questions, we'll go around at the end. Just raise your hand and we can ask the panel. So Jamila, if you want to come back up, and Anne and Ben and Malini, and I'll introduce everybody. Come and take a seat. I'll come and sit over here. There we go. Give them all a big round of applause. So we've got Neurosurgeon Ben Jonker, we've got Malini Rizvi, who I mentioned earlier. She's a patient and a representative from the Australian Pituitary Foundation. And of course, you've met Jamila. And then we have endocrinologist and Associate Professor Anne McCormack. So give them all a big round of applause. You're going to be hearing all their knowledge about pituitary issues. I'm going to start with Malini, though. We've just heard about Jamila's experiences, but can you also share with us and share with the audience some of the struggles that patients with pituitary disease face that we don't really hear enough about?
Thanks, Sophie. So in terms of pituitary disease, I think the journey to diagnosis is often not really understood. So for me, it was 20 years till I got diagnosed.
For 20 years for you to get a diagnosis.
So by that time, you've gone to so many doctors, you've been misdiagnosed, you've gone down so many rabbit holes. people don't believe that you're sick, you're told you're a hypochondriac, and you become to question yourself and question whether you really understand your body. And by the time you get diagnosed, after multiple tests, poking and prodding, you are exhausted. So you're exhausted, and then you've got the diagnosis. So then you have to go through all the hoops of pituitary surgery and more blood tests and constant tests. So I think that is something that is not really talked about, like the challenges to get there, because a lot of the symptoms mask as other diseases. So it's very hard to diagnose, and there's a lack of awareness out there for some like GPs to know what tests to do to kind of pinpoint what you've got.
And we were talking earlier that there had been a hint in your blood tests. If only a doctor had looked at it. Can you share that with the audience?
So in 2009 or around then, I found my blood tests, and it said Cushing's disease ? But it also had insulin resistance, PCOS, and diabetes. So my doctors went down the insulin resistance, PCOS, and diabetes route because they're more common and they know how to treat that. So that was 4 years before I actually got diagnosed.
And what about, I might just also get you to talk about some of the other issues like fatigue and things that patients with pituitary illness live with.
So I think that, I guess pituitary disease is multifaceted. So there's the endpoints of, so when you have pituitary surgery, the tumour's removed. So on the scan, it looks like the tumour's removed. Then that may reduce your cortisol. So on the bloods, the cortisol looks fine. But actually, that's not just the fix. I think that it's underestimated how much fatigue and how much the mental health element of the disease as you try and get back to normal. Like, it doesn't happen overnight. It could take a couple of years. And so that kind of constant, like you think that, like the night before my brain surgery the first time, I was so excited because I thought that I'd fix all my symptoms, but it took a while to get back to normal, and that's kind of challenging mentally. That for someone who's always busy and always wanting to get up and go, to be told to, or not be able to get up and get out of the house is actually quite confronting.
Thank you for sharing that. We'll come back to you in a second. And Jamila, you mentioned your son, but I'm interested, obviously diseases like this don't just affect the patient, that they affect the whole family. And what has it meant for, like say for example, for your husband? Has he had to take on more of a carer's role?
Yeah, absolutely. So my husband has ADHD, and which means he has the ability to hyper-focus. And he has hyper-focused on my illness in the most useful way.
Oh, that's good. At least it's useful. That's
this
good.
Insanely disorganised man is like a superhero when it comes to my experience of hospitals and doctors. Every time we are in a new hospital or with a new medical team, someone will pause and go, "You medical?" to him, and he's like, "Mm-mm." And it is honestly it has become an obsession. He watched my surgeries on YouTube beforehand. It's really quite odd. But I say that in the husband and wife way, where you have to rib your partner. But honestly, like, what could be a more caring thing to do than to almost try and upskill yourself to be the best support that you can be? And he has made his own sacrifices when it comes to work. He has made his own sacrifices when it's come to, he missed his brother's wedding in the States because my surgery time got moved, and he decided he didn't want to be apart from me in the week before a craniotomy. And so decided not to go in case there might be a risk that he didn't get back in time. So he's made enormous sacrifices and keeps making sacrifices. He really lucked out on the sickness and in health part of the wedding vows, poor guy. I've done fine. And he's also, I think, been there for our son in a way in the times where I just couldn't be because I was too fatigued or I wasn't up to it. I think we're very even parents again now, but there was a period there where he was really shouldering the majority burden. And I don't think we talk about the role of unpaid carers enough. And I don't think he ever would have used that terminology of carer. I've been doing some work with Carers Australia the last couple of years, talking about the fact that so many unpaid carers don't know what support is available for them, financial support, emotional support, and the rest. And it was only through me doing a podcast for them that he was like, oh, I'm kind of a carer. And I was like, yeah.
And I just want to quickly pick up on one other thing you said, which goes to the nature of chronic illness, that a lot of people, particularly people who don't have a chronic illness, don't really understand that it's not something that's going to go away. You're not going to just bounce back and be necessarily the person you were. It's not like just getting a cold that you get over in a day or two. Yet the majority of people, live with chronic illnesses all the time. So how challenging is that to sort of, when people do say, oh, so are you better now? And you sort of go, well no.
So I probably cheat the question now, and I usually go like headline, tumour not growing.
Yep.
And that's usually what people want, because people want you to say something positive. They don't want you to be like, let me tell you about all my medication.
Yeah, how long have you got?
They're not, the average person, your mum might be interested, but you're right, the average person is not actually that interested. So I usually try and keep it simple. One of the things I have found really helpful for me, and I recognise it's difficult for people, different people have different levels of how comfortable they are with being open about their health, but I've been really honest. Without giving too much information, I've been really honest with my colleagues and with my boss, and also with the people who work for me. And they are so incredibly helpful. And the things that they do to make my life easier, like I have retrograde amnesia, which means, a lot of the things post the surgery, I struggle to hold on to information, which can be difficult when you're doing a big job that involves a lot of media. I forgot the treasurer's name on TV the other night. That was really bad. Had to keep saying him. So big apologies to Jim Chalmers. But I think one of the things the team has done is they are actively filling the gaps.
Yeah.
I have multiple team members who now will send an email half an hour before the meeting with, hey, just thought you'd want to know with the agenda, here are all the links to the things we discussed last week and the outcomes that we reached and what you said. And you're like,
thank you.
God, thank God someone remembers what I said, because I don't remember what I said.
Yeah.
And I have an incredible boss who's been really, really generous. She was trying to hire me when I first got diagnosed. She hired me 6 weeks into the recovery. I didn't start for a bit longer. And then when I got back, 8 weeks in, I said, I need 14 weeks off to have a craniotomy and recover. And she just said to me, but you won't have any sick leave yet. And I was like, no. And she said, well, what will you do about that? And I was like, I don't know. We'll figure it out. And she called our parent company and just gave me my sick leave for the next 10 years and just said, wow, we'll figure it out later.
That's so good. That's fantastic. So Anne, I'll move on to you. So having managed so many patients, hundreds of patients with pituitary disease, and you've heard of some of the issues that our patients on the panel have talked about. Are there other things that you see commonly that you want to share with the audience?
Thanks, Sophie. Yeah, I think we've heard a lot about the fatigue and the anxiety, and I think they're two pervasive things that I struggle in, I guess helping people with, and we can replace pituitary, we can give them tablets and we can give all sorts of things, but we can't quite make it as right as the normal functioning pituitary, and that causes a whole lot of things. I think two things that I was going to say on this subject though, around awareness and taking that a little bit further. I think even the public is unaware, but even health professionals outside of the endocrine community really don't understand pituitary disease. And to the point where we've recently changed the name of diabetes insipidus to arginine vasopressin deficiency, purely because of a case in the UK where somebody died in hospital because they couldn't get access to their Minorin or the DDAVP because somebody thought that they had diabetes mellitus, which is the common diabetes, which obviously bears similar name, and they basically didn't understand and denied someone treatment, and they ended up dehydrating and dying. And that case got a lot of attention in the UK and led to this sort of name change, which has then now taken across, it's taken a few years to develop. But that's an example, I think, of how difficult we find within the medical community to even get the health professionals to understand. And because of all of that, patients really have to advocate for themselves and, go and find the person who's going to understand about the disease. And that's not only, they're already dealing with fatigue, they have to then go and find more of their carers, and so poor people, it becomes ongoingly challenging. We would love to have a nurse. So the support structures are just not there for patients with pituitary disease. I would love to be able to ring up a nurse after I've delivered a message that somebody has a tumour and be able to, make sure that somebody could be called the following day, for instance, or even that afternoon about a diagnosis. And yet I know that they leave the room and they've got 101 other questions that arise, and there's limited resources that I've got to be able to manage that. There is just no nurse that someone can call. So the support structures, the resources are just not there.
Interesting. Okay, well, and we can talk more about that in a little while. And Ben, I'm just going to turn to you now. And we've heard about how complex pituitary issues are and pituitary care, but and there's multiple clinicians that are involved. But can you talk from a surgical point of view? How do people find you, and do they sometimes go to a whole lot of other, doctors first? And how important is it that, and I might get you to explain what you explained to me when we had our briefing about that pituitary surgery is actually very, very different to a lot of other neurosurgery. So
it's interesting. Neurosurgery is surgery on the brain and the spine, but the surgery for the pituitary is kind of a totally different approach. It's we typically go through the nose for most pituitary surgery, and what you do with your other neurosurgery operations doesn't necessarily prepare you that much better for pituitary surgery. And so that being the case, I think actually it is an area of surgery where it genuinely is important to do a significant volume of work in that area, because otherwise, you don't have translatable experience that you can use to do it better. So I think, obviously we're really fortunate at St Vincent's, but there's a lot of facets to this multidisciplinary care. So we've got, we've got the fact that obviously you as the surgeon get to, are involved with these cases, but the having a sort of a high volume of pituitary surgery means that, when the nurse on the ward calls you about the patient, they already know what's going on with the patients. They're upskilled, the ICU people are upskilled, the radiologists...
Because they look at all those sort of
scans. The radiologists
are
used to look at the scans all the time. It's just good from every perspective when there's a sort of a team of people who are sort of doing it regularly, and it's also enjoyable as well. So that's the other side.
And it's as fantastic as St Vincent's is, not every patient in Australia can get access to come here, I would imagine. So how do we improve, say, for patients in regional or rural areas to get access to the sort of expertise that you have here?
Yeah, well, that's a tricky one. I think there's no question that there has to be a certain centralisation of pituitary care, but it can be a bit of a hub and spoke model, particularly from the endocrinologist perspective, with having people more locally and then referring people in for surgery. And I think, on a sort of related topic, I think it's good that that there's things like the Pituitary Foundation where people who are diagnosed with pituitary tumours can at least ask the question, like, who should I go and see? What should I go and do? Because I was just chatting to a patient of mine actually about how, in some countries medical systems are very funneled into specialty centres, whereas in Australia we're a little bit more sort of an egalitarian approach, or something we can sort of, anyone can put up their hand and say, I'm a neurosurgeon, I can do a pituitary operation, and sometimes that's maybe not the best thing for care. So,
Okay, thank you, Ben. So, Malini, I might go back to you, and it clearly sounds like there needs to be more support for patients with pituitary disease. What are some of the current ways that people can get support, though, that exist at the moment?
So as you know, the pituitary journey is quite a lonely journey. So comparing my two experiences, so my first surgery was in 2013. I didn't know much about the condition when I was diagnosed, apart from Dr. Google, which is always not very useful. I went to a surgeon who hadn't done many pituitary surgeries, and an endocrinologist who wasn't as familiar, and so that surgery wasn't successful. So after that I Googled and found the Australian Pituitary Foundation, who were looking for board members, and I wanted to advocate for patients because my journey wasn't that great. And I think that that's the first time I felt understood because I could talk to patients who'd been through it before. And it also makes you feel like you're not crazy and that the symptoms are real. And then also the information and fact sheets that the foundation provides also makes you more informed about the condition, so you can ask the questions. And then, as Ben said, like talking to other patients, finding like the concept of a multidisciplinary team and how important that is for care, and finding a medical team who are experts in the field. So my second surgery, I was also more informed and better equipped to deal with the challenges, knowing what to expect, and it was a much smoother experience. So I think the foundation can provide you with that information, but we also advocate for listing of some drugs on the PBS by giving that quality of life lens over it, because the economics sometimes may not cut it, but the impact of the quality of life, not only on the patients, but also the carers and the people, the whole ecosystem around a patient, is really important to acknowledge. And so we have been successful in advocating for a couple of drugs. And as well, we have set up support groups for each pituitary condition now. So that provides a really good support network just to bounce ideas off and just to really feel heard and understood.
Fantastic. And I might just ask Jamila, we've talked about, we've heard about some support that's out there, but are there other strategies that have helped you to adjust to living with a disease that was so life-changing? What do you think were the things that really helped you?
Therapy? No, I think there's been a whole bunch of things that have helped. I think I would add to the support group point. I sort of went hunting and found a craniopharyngioma group that's a global group, because a rare condition, so not going to find that many people in Australia, but with that global group there's about 400 of us, and so that just gave me people to talk to, which was really nice. And I don't want to sound too Pollyanna, but I think also seeing other people diagnosed who are around the same age after me and being able to say, how can I help? At least you felt like your knowledge was good for something. And your experience could at least maybe make it a smidge easier for somebody else. I think the other thing for me is I have been really fortunate. I didn't go through the big search for a diagnosis. Everything happened relatively quickly, mostly thanks to a really vigilant GP who took a missed period from a 31-year-old with a 2-year-old really seriously, which I think a lot of GPs would have gone, you just finished breastfeeding, don't worry about it. She was really pushy and I think helped me get answers really fast. But the whole team that I've sort of we've pulled together around me are so outstanding and talk to each other. And I think that's a really big one when it comes to the medical profession, is making sure your specialists are well connected, and often that's not just going to happen by osmosis. So something that's really helped me is really making sure that I am constantly communicating what one specialist is saying to the other. And that includes those that do sometimes get a bit left out of the loop, like the dietitians or exercise physiologists who aren't necessarily going to be sending letters all of the time. But for example, I know there's patients in the room, if you're someone who's on steroids for your whole life, one of the big risks is your bone density and osteoporosis. And I had much lower than average bone density 2 years ago, and I now have much higher than average bone density, purely because I'm not drinking any more milk, purely because of working with an exercise physiologist for 2 years who has been connected to the other specialists, and he has been life-changing. So I think a lot of it is about getting the right team around you and then getting the team to talk to one another.
Fantastic. What about you, Malini? Are there other things like that you've been able to sort of put in place that have made the journey a bit easier for you, or that you think that are sort of really important to navigate the day-to-day living with the pituitary illness?
I think it's, firstly the support network of the foundation, and also just talking to other people. But I think it's also acknowledging that if you're tired, and it's okay, and just being kind to yourself, and acknowledging the holistic journey, so not just the medical aspects, but the mental health, and just making sure that, that you just look at it as a whole, not just as a part. And then also just being an advocate for your own health.
Good on you. And so, Ben, I'm just wondering, with the surgery, are there sort of things on the horizon that are happening with surgery, or like what does the future hold for surgery? Is it generally successful, or would you want to see more successful outcomes? What are you hoping will happen in the future?
So in the last, say, 15, 20 years, pituitary surgery has gone from almost entirely microscope-based to entirely endoscope-based, and that gives us a much better visualisation, much better lighting when we do the surgery. We've started to increasingly, there's an area where the pituitary gland sits, and most tumours sit in that central area, but then there's an area off to the sides which has the carotid arteries and some important nerves. And now more and more we're starting to explore those side areas to remove tumour from those. At the end of the day, it's still not every pituitary tumour is completely curable, and maybe that may never be a surgical goal, because we do have other treatments like focused radiation, for example, that we can use to treat residual tumour. But combination of those things, and I guess, I think better decision making as we continue to learn more about it's going to be a big thing too.
And you mentioned getting access to surgeries to be able to actually, or like operating theatres to actually do the operation is an issue as well. That
is a challenge for us, just the logistics of it. The pressure on beds in the hospital, particularly in the public hospital, is immense, and getting the ICU beds to be able to do the operations and do them in, what we would consider to be a timely fashion is hard. So I think one of the biggest advances in pituitary tumour surgery that could happen at the moment would be if we were able to get more operating time to do it. Yeah.
Oh, that's something to aim for. So Anne, we might just, Jamila, did you have something to say?
No, sorry, I'm just blind on this side, so I was turning.
No, that's all right. So Anne, I wanted you to share with the audience some of the work, the research that you're doing, and what you're hoping that might lead to in terms of breakthroughs for patients with pituitary disease.
So thanks. So really what I've built up the research here about is trying to better understand the cause of pituitary tumour development, better rationalise and predict tumour behaviour, because not all tumours are the same, and finally to, utilise some of the expertise that we have within genomics and here, and utilise all the new treatments that are coming to cancer, is to be able to pull them across to the pituitary and look and explore those novel treatments and try to apply them to the pituitary gland, because we're often thought about as we'd like to change in the last sort of space of anything. So we, just as an example, I think, years ago, radiation was fairly arbitrarily applied to patients who had a residual tumour after an operation. And when I was training in the UK, it was very much the standard practice. You have a tumour that's a little bit left behind, you give radiation. But we all know that radiation carries some side effects and some long-term issues. Wouldn't it be good to be able to predict a tumour that really required that radiation to begin with, so we could prevent some of the issues occurring downstream? And I think that's what we're trying to develop, is some rationalisation of what treatments we offer. And on the flip side of that, wouldn't it be good to predict a tumour that was going to behave much worse than another tumour, so that we could then, put them on the genomics pathway, get them into the cancer sort of pathway more than other patients, in order to access the new treatments and the things that are coming earlier than they otherwise would get access. So it's working at both ends of the spectrum. And I'd just like to highlight some of my team. I know they're not going to want to. But Dr. Nell Lenders here in the front row is an endocrinologist who's working and is coming to the end of her PhD, and has really worked on subtyping of pituitary tumours. So we really need to better understand what types of tumours. They're not actually simple as what you may, or they're not simple to anyone, but there are actually many more subtypes, and she's worked at characterising them with the help of our lovely pathology team who are at the back. And also she's identified a new subtype really within that, and we're working to characterise that subtype. What we'd like to do then is go on, and she's got some analysis of a whole lot of biomarkers under the microscope, again with the pathologists, and we're trying to rationalise the approach for using these new biomarkers to try to develop, ideally, an online prediction tool, so that if you're a clinician sitting there, you can actually say to your patient, you have a 25% chance that your tumour is going to grow in 5 years. At the moment, we cannot give numbers, we cannot give any statistics, we just say, we think you've got an increased risk, but it would be nice for patients to have more of a tool. So we're trying to develop that. So that's a lot of Nell's work. And then I'm going to come, where is Lydia, sitting right next to Nell? Dr. Lydia Lamb is also an endocrinologist who is working with the genomics team in medical oncology. And what we're trying to do there is to better define the tumour microenvironment, which is a very interesting area of tumour biology, in pituitary tumours, and also then look at some of the biomarkers as well that they're using in other cancer types, and then look at them in pituitary tumours and say, well, the medicine that is being used for that, can we use it in pituitary tumours? So that's some of the work that Lydia's doing. And Annabelle over here, Dr. Annabelle Hayes, is our current fellow who would love to go on to do a PhD next year in traumatic brain injury and looking into hypopituitarism that occurs with that. As we've talked about, it's a big issue, but it's a big issue to try to get the logistics to set that all up. At the moment, there's absolutely no resources set up, and I've had talks with rehab physicians and all sorts of things who really just don't look into that at all. So there's a lot of work to be done there. And we've done lots of other things, genomic research, and we've identified a couple of interesting genes, and we've done audits and looking at our surgical outcomes, which I have to say are right up there with the US and UK, well-known institutions. So we're definitely punching, I think, above our weight. Actually, it was useful for me to write all of this down because I sort of went, oh my gosh, yes, we are doing quite a lot for what we've actually been able to source. And I suppose this brings me back to one of the key messages one of the reasons that we're really here today is that over the last 10 or so years, I've built up a pituitary biobank, which is an incredibly valuable resource for studying research. So every time a patient has a pituitary operation here, they have the choice, and most people, 99%, say they would like to deposit a remnant of the tumour in the bank for which we can do research. And we have about 500 samples, Tanya will be able to tell me now, banked up in that time. Now, I was able to initially set up, pharma companies in the past used to give a little bit of donations here and there, or pharma, funding to set up those sorts of things. And over time, with Medicines Australia and various other things, they've just tightened up a lot of that. There is no more funding that you can get for any infrastructure, and you can't get any funding from any really big medical research facilities or anywhere for infrastructure like that. And so if the biobank cannot have somebody like Tanya, who's been with me for 10 years since we started it all up, more than 10 years now, then the research stops. Now, as well as the research stopping, we cannot get tissue to then send it through for genomic testing for people who have really nasty tumours, and so that stops. And there is just no mechanism to allow that to happen without a biobank officer. So that is probably my number one thing. Without that, the whole thing falls apart. So we, and then I could talk about all of the things that we need money for to do all the extra genomics research that we want to do that costs 5 times the price that we thought it was going to cost. So there's a lot of project-related funding as well. And then on the wish list, God, wouldn't it be nice if we talked about the nurse, having a nurse? Wouldn't it be nice to have a dedicated fellow position where we could send someone overseas, for instance, to bring back training and skills to us here and improve what we can offer? Wouldn't it be nice to have a surgical fellowship, upskill some surgeons who are going to take over from the crew at the moment? So I guess there's a lot to be done, but we can start small and we can grow it.
That's great. Look, it's great to have a wish list, and this is the audience to give it to, so thank you for that. Now, we've only got a couple of minutes left. If you've got a question for the panel, just pop up your hand, and we've got someone who'll come around with a microphone. Have we got a question here?
Hi, just my question for Jamila. Your memory, is that something that affects you now? As in, do you forget things, or?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, it definitely does. I think for a while I wasn't quite sure how bad it was, because everyone forgets things, right? And when you really focus on the fact that you're forgetting things, you can blow things out of proportion. So I started to be a bit unsure. I ended up seeing a neurologist and getting a full sort of scale testing, which took 2 half days, to do it all. And that came back and showed where all of the weakness was. And it was sort of almost a comparative thing. You could show where I was performing, where I was unaffected, and where I was, and It was the difference between like a 97th percentile and a 32nd percentile. It was big. So yeah, I definitely still forget things. I have a lot of strategies, I suppose, in place to help me. I talked about my son before. You know, we walk out the front door and he goes, "Is the oven off? Are the lights off? Do we have our keys?" Like, it's all and like it's useful because I often leave the oven on. And the team at work are really good in the same way. When I said they send things through in advance, they do that for a reason because I often will forget entirely. But thankfully, the rest of my cognition is the same and works well. So I find that if I am obsessive about calendars and lists and the like, that I can mostly cover it.
Good question. Any other questions from the audience? I just had a quick question I just wanted to ask before we wrap up about advocacy, what you'd like the audience to take away and put into practice about raising awareness of pituitary disease. So we'll start with Anne and we'll ask each of you, if you could get everyone in the audience to do one thing to raise awareness about pituitary disease, what would you want them to do? Tell someone about it or donate money to the Curran Foundation? What?
Look, I think it's spreading the message, and maybe if you know somebody who happens to have some political influence, for instance, or some influence in the community otherwise, I think it's talking to them about that so that we can try and get this on the agenda for so many reasons. Yeah.
And Jamila, what about you? What would you like the audience to take away and put into practice to really raise the awareness of this issue?
Yeah, I think firstly to the medical practitioners in the room, I have had the most outstanding medical treatment. I could not fault it at any point. The one thing I would say though was the first time I was ever asked if I'd seen a psychologist was about 2.5 years in. Your patients need to be talking to someone because it's a massive, massive life change. And I think the sooner that that's suggested to someone, I mean, I'd sought the support anyway, but I think the sooner that that's suggested, the better, would be my first message. And then I think the second one is generally being willing to have conversations. I think we have a practice in the way we interact with each other. We generally don't talk about health stuff because you sort of push it away or it feels inappropriate or you're like, oh, no one wants to know about my problems, particularly when you're the patient. So I think if you're not the patient, if you're willing to have those conversations, then it feels less like we're making it all about us.
Thank you. And Emily?
Yeah, I think that I'd like to, amplify the message of the foundation, but also in the mainstream community of pituitary disease. So it is not a rare disease, it is common. So we need to have that message out there, and also just, seeing it in mainstream media, like getting the same attention as breast cancer or the Cancer Council. Like, we just need to elevate the profile of pituitary.
And Ben, finally?
Finally, I would just echo the comments of the other people in the crowd. There's nothing else to say except that it deserves more attention than it gets at the moment.
Okay, we've got one last quick question. Yep. And then Anne, did you want to do a wrap up after that?
I don't actually have a question, but I think goes to what your comment was about advocacy. You actually have two people here, Catherine Skelsey, who was one of the original members of the Pituitary Foundation, and myself, and we used to look for a patron. We used to, go looking for somebody who was a politician or somebody who was really well known to be a patron of the foundation, because we felt that was the only way we were going to raise it. And we used to kind of look around saying, well, wouldn't there be some famous person who actually had pituitary disease and would step forward, like has happened in so many other diseases that are out there. So I think that's really important, and I think a lot of us do that advocacy. My daughter, if somebody comes up to her and says, will you donate money to Heart Foundation or to the Cancer or something, when you've got a pituitary research, come back to me. So I think that's...
Thank you for that comment. Anne's just going to say a last few words.
So, thank you, Sophie. I think you've done an amazing job, actually, of bringing together, I think, the critical aspects of what we're trying to talk about tonight. So we really appreciate your time. Thank you.
Pleasure.
I'd also like to obviously thank our panellists, Jamila, Malini and Ben. Thank you for being here tonight and waving the flag for pituitary disease, and all your insights are incredible and really, really valuable, so thank you for that. I think you can hear from what we've discussed the importance of what we're trying to do, the lack of awareness, and hearing it more again, I think it just propels me further to want to keep going with this, with the effort in research, because we realise how unique a position we're in. And so, Craig, where are you? I think I've got some tokens of appreciation, or somebody's coming, or they're here. Oh, there we go. I'll grab them. Just hold on to that, please. One at a time. One at a time. I'm going to trip up, probably. Sorry, you got me in front.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Sophie, or falling. Ben. Thank you.
This looks good.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much.
Okay. I'd like to also thank the team who are really, you're ongoingly dedicated, you're committed to doing what we keep, we have a common vision for, so I really want to thank you for that ongoing effort. And I really do think we've made progress in what we do, and I hope that each day forward we continue to make progress. So thank you for your commitment with me. Now there's someone in particular that I would like to thank. Tanya, can you please come up? So as I mentioned, Tanya, she's worked with me now for over 10 years, and she is just extraordinary. She always goes above and beyond for everything. If there's a surgery occurring out of hours, she will come in out of her time to collect the tumour to go into the precious biobank. She knows exactly how to collect and do it all perfectly. She extracts all the DNA, that's the genetic material from the tumours, and this allows obviously the genetic testing to take place in clinical trials. She helps our PhD students with all the essential lab techniques. She's always calm, she's totally professional, and navigates every aspect of research. So I really couldn't do any of what I do without you. So I hope that this is a small token of appreciation. So I'd also like to thank Katrina Dowling and Craig McCall from the St Vincent's Curran Foundation, and Tim, I believe you're here as well. Thank you for all of your work in bringing this tonight together. And finally, to everybody here, to our guests, thank you for joining me. I hope you really have brought away or learnt something new a little bit about a pituitary disease that you didn't already know, and thank you for listening and listening about what things we're trying to do here in terms of advancing research. If you've enjoyed listening and you feel compelled to make a difference, please consider that you could make a donation philanthropically towards our research. We do have various donation forms that I think are on your chairs, and we warmly welcome any pledge gifts to enable us to continue our work into the future. All gifts over $2 are fully tax deductible. We also have an online silent auction which has been going until the end of April. There are a few items that are very worthwhile bidding on, so have a look, and it's a separate thing, so the details are on flyers, which I believe are hanging around somewhere if you didn't already see it on your invitation. So, of course, I'm very happy if you want to discuss options of anything specifically that we've talked about tonight. If you want to connect with me or colleagues through the Curran Foundation, please don't hesitate in contacting us. More than happy to sit down with you, walk through things with you, just to understand what it is that you might like to do to help out. So with that, I'd like to close. I wish you all the very best in health, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.